Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland. The key to any great company is the people. But if you don't put some real thought into hiring, if you don't develop a philosophy early around how you are going to compensate your employees, you're going to be in a world of hurt later, says Shannon Schiltz, who heads up a16z's people practice.
You don't build a product without having a product roadmap. Right. And so if you're going to build a company, you've got to have a roadmap on how you're going to attract the best talent and how you're going to retain the best talent.
Compensation, from salary to different forms of equity, is the topic of this segment of the a16z podcast. For the founders of many fast-growing companies, it's a bit of an afterthought, says the other expert on the pod, Nguyen.
When you're at this kind of high-velocity hiring rate, I think people forget about what's my strategy and what direction am I pointing at, because they're solving for very short-term needs of that initial recruitment process. Right. And that candidate saying, well, I've got so-and-so willing to pay me X, Y, Z. And you're in that trench. You're trying to fight to win that. And then you look down the road, you're 100 people, 80 people, and you really don't have a core essence of how you've paid your people.
Today we are talking about compensation. And to help us do that, we have Shannon Schiltz, who heads up our people practices here at the firm. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you.
And Nguyen, who is another compensation expert. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, compensation. In this job market where people are fighting to hire people, I thought you compensate people by paying them well, market rate if not better. You hand out options. If you're a founder of a company, that's what you do, and you're off and running. What's wrong with that approach?
I think if you take a step back and think about compensation in general, it's a hot topic. A lot of people talk about it. So many people are focusing on the short-term problem, which actually is your long-term strategy, but it's hiring people. How do I compensate them? How do I pull them from big companies? How do I pull them from their comp packages that they currently have and make them a part of this team? But when you're thinking about that, you have to think short-term and long-term.
Okay, so paint a picture for us when you have people come in and talk to you, or you go in and talk to them because they're not quite doing it right. I've started a company. In that first phase, what am I facing down and what am I typically not doing correctly?
So I don't know if it's not doing correctly.
Or thinking about.
Right,
maybe.
And I would say that's exactly it. It's what am I not thinking about? And so if you think about, and I feel really fortunate in that I get to see seed founders, I get to see folks who are A, B round, and then I also get to work with growth companies. And so if you look at the picture, folks they start the process by, I need market data to hire these 3 people that are actually going to build the first version of the product.
Right.
And that's a very simple process. You look at market data, and from a cash perspective, you have every founder has their philosophy around the cash perspective, because cash is usually tight. Yeah. Where they're not thinking as much long-term is the equity piece, the upside. You join my company now, you're taking a lot of risk, you're not going to have a lot of cash. What am I doing with regards to equity? And so I would say, at that stage, you probably don't have to have a compensation philosophy. But then as you start scaling as an organization, that's when you really have to think about, how am I going to hire people? How am I going to be consistent with my equity? And how am I going to retain these people, given that I have the least amount of footage on each person that I'm bringing on board and giving equity to on how they're actually going to perform inside my company?
By footage, you mean like we are a football team and I'm looking at the game footage?
Correct.
I gotcha. Okay. Ton.
And I think to add to that, once you are in this kind of growth hiring phase, you're asked to hire a lot of different talent, and that diversity means there's diversity in pay, there's diversity in assessment, there's diversity in seniority, contribution level. And when you're at this kind of high velocity hiring rate, I think people forget about what's my strategy and what direction am I pointing at, because they're solving for very short-term needs of that initial recruitment process.
Right.
And that candidate saying, well, I've got so-and-so willing to pay me X, Y, Z. and you're in that trench. You're trying to fight to win that, and then you look down the road, you're 100 people, 80 people, and you really don't have a core essence of how you've paid your people.
So
And
again,
it's
to
all
be
over the place.
to be a little bit specific, then in that first phase, it really is okay. How much am I gonna pay these people? To lure them in. So this first handful, equity is sort of part of the package, obviously, but that's a simpler calculus, I guess, with fewer people. Then the philosophy kicks in when you, like you say, Tan, hit whatever. 30, 40, 60 people.
We've been recommending for companies that they really start thinking about the types of folks and the types of comp packages they're going to be giving people as soon as they're going to hit high growth. So when you have a handful of people that you're hiring, it's very easy to stay on top of it. I had a conversation with a company yesterday, and I realized they kept referring to we want everyone to be equal. And I said, it's not about being equal, it's about being consistent, right? So knowing what type of people you're hiring, what the criticality of those roles are for the type of people you're hiring, and differentiating on your compensation model for the criticality to the organization and like how much they're going to contribute to the organization.
Well, so let's talk about the different philosophies that are out there, and then what are the signals that maybe, like you say, if you aren't consistent, this will happen on the other end. But let's talk about philosophies first.
Well, I think philosophies, I mean, that's a big and broad term, and it scares some folks when you talk about that, especially companies are in kind of that earlier stage and they're growing, because we don't want it to be onerous. The philosophy, in my mind, philosophy is about the direction or the intent from which you're going to grow. And philosophy actually helps you kind of fundamentally put some quantitative data behind what you're doing, right? So when we talk about philosophy, the first line is really around pay positioning within the vehicles of pay that we typically see, and that is cash. That's cash plus bonus. I mean, salary plus bonus, and then typically equity in the form of what we see. I mean, right now we're not really talking about benefits, the other perks, but those are really the core components that we're always addressing. But establishing or even understanding your market positioning to what your defined competitive, sample group is, or your proxy that you compare against, helps you ground from a numbers perspective how you're going to measure where you're at. Not doing so will really confuse kind of how you think about compensation. So you have to take a broader picture about, the size of company you're at, the type of business, kind of the product market fit, your evolution, how quickly you've gotten to revenue, et cetera, and really be thoughtful about that as you compare to a data set that makes you comfortable, from which you can start to develop some communications and actually a point of reference to your employee base that says, hey, we've been thoughtful about this. We understand where we're at right now. Here's where we're going, and here are the companies we want to be like. And this is what they're paying. Right. We're going to step function into that, right? And we're not going to be disingenuous in saying we're going to be there, right? So that level of understanding needs to be in place. And you can't get to that level of understanding unless you have some good data behind you.
So that data comes from comparing yourself to the competition, from your own internal, obviously, checks and balances and what you have already.
Yeah, and there's obviously other, published surveys, or there's, with our firm, we sample all of our clients and we have the detail and data behind that. So a lot of our clients that come to us, and a lot of A16 companies come to us, we're helping them try to position where they are in the marketplace and helping them establish that just baseline framework. Sometimes it's a lot more complex. It depends on, obviously the maturity of the organization and the understanding of the leadership. But, at a baseline, we definitely need to extract what that market level is.
Companies all have reputations. I'm just wondering, when I'm a young company, you want to be competitive with all your competitors. Can this make you more competitive? And if so, how so?
We talk to, I get to work with the companies on the recruiting side as well as on compensation and everything HR related. One of the things that we always share with our entrepreneurs is it's really, really important that you can have a conversation about how you are building out and being consistent across the organization from a compensation perspective. People join your company wanting to know that if they perform and they do a great job, that they will be rewarded for it. So if you actually, and if you put in place a philosophy, you can actually speak to rewarding your top performers. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's a huge selling point in the recruiting process now. People want to know that that's going to happen for them. One of the things I wanted to comment on really quick, when you were talking about philosophy, we also come across people really confusing philosophy and process, right? So when you start talking to a company about you should really think about your compensation philosophy, a lot of times they're thinking this is going to be a process they have to put in place. And it's not, it's confusing the two. And the philosophy is what actually helps you with consistency across the organization.
Types of philosophies are, look, we want it to be equal. We want to be consistent. We want to be the best or the highest paid in the marketplace. We want to, attract the cheapest people.
Well, that's general philosophy. I think, part of the philosophy, if you start to break that down, it is really, hey, from a cash perspective, this is objectively where we're at in the business. We want to kind of goal for being in the market median of this data set in terms of data of cash, right, say. And, maybe within this engineering function or product function, we actually have to go higher on our philosophy and pay at the 75th or the 80th within different pay components. And by identifying or actually putting a flag post that says we're going to pay there, what you're doing is developing a communication string with your employees that says, guys, here's how we're paying, and here's how we're looking at data. And the data set that we're looking at the 75th percentile or the 85th percentile says let's just hypothetically, a senior engineer with approximately said years of experience is going to make around this at the upper quartile of this pay band. Right. So, you're not just saying that, you're actually taking some tangible data. Now, everybody's going to have their own opinions on where the data comes from, but that's the stance. You have a platform from which you're using, and that's going to evolve, right?
The other thing that it allows you to do is I keep going back to the word consistency because it's so transparent. Like everyone's very transparent. Back when I was running HR at Opsware, I don't think our employees talked a lot to each other about what they were making. And so...
It's different now.
It's different now. A lot of people talk about what they're making.
Open source comp, as I say. Everybody knows everybody's.
Right. And so, but the thing is if you have a strategy and a belief on what you're paying for different roles, different people in the organization, you can stand behind that when somebody comes and asks you a question. Right. And I think that's really, really important because the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want your employees to feel in the recruiting process, had they negotiated better, they would have a better comp package.
Got it.
Right? You want them to feel that you're consistent. And if you've actually thought about compensation, when you're recruiting someone, you can say point blank to them, this is what I'm paying. This is what the next person who comes in, who's maybe even a better negotiator than you, is going to make this too. Right? I'm very consistent because I've looked at it, I've put thought into it, and this is market for these roles. Even
if I'm not paying top in the market or in the top quartile or whatever, I do feel like there's other things that companies can offer though, right? You're working on a tough problem. You're working on something that will see the light of day. You are working on something will help, half of humanity.
I think it still has to boil down to that. I mean, compensation is compensation, right? I always say to people, there's always going to be somebody that's going to pay more.
Yep.
And there's always going to be somebody that's going to pay a lot more.
But if you also look at attrition data, people don't leave a company because of comp. People leave a company for many other reasons.
Right.
They'll use that they're going to make more at their next company, but it is usually... there's a different, if you actually scratch at the surface, you will find out there's a different reason they're leaving.
Okay.
They have to feel that they're being paid fairly. And that means they have to feel that they're being paid fairly in the market and against their peers. And this is where if you have a philosophy, you're answering both of those. But then, and we're assuming that the compensation discussion is important in actually the recruiting process. The compensation discussion is the last piece of it. Well, it should be the first piece, and then at the closing the candidate, which means that they're interested in your company because of either other kick-ass engineers they're going to be working with, an incredible product that they like believe in, or, you know, a market that is like going crazy. Like all of those things will actually dictate if you are going to be able to even get to a compensation discussion with someone.
Right.
So that's where it's being consistent and doing it right when you get to an offer.
And lack of consistency, what are some sure signs that you are lacking consistency?
Well, I think that comes up pretty evident. I mean, after, let's just call it that honeymoon phase of a year, if people feel like there's inconsistencies and just what Shannon said, if we can't communicate about in a transparent manner about how we pay people, it's clear. I see so many situations, clients that come to me and they really have really pressing issues around turnover and around people not happy, and they cite that it's around compensation, but you dig into it and they don't have very strong communication about their ability to really address success, really kind of be thoughtful about conversations, and it, you know, and you talk to the actual employee, it's like, well, I think I got a raw deal. I didn't negotiate early enough.
Right.
And
that's usually compared to colleague Y, who, as you say, everybody knows what those people are making anyway, right?
Yeah.
or how they're compensated.
Exactly.
Well, okay, so let's shift gears to equity. We talked a little, we've talked about the salary part. How, startups and technology in particular have this wonderful way of compensating people through stock, and yet right now, it's sort of fraught where people are trying to figure out the most equitable way to do equity. How do you guys approach it, and how should people start to think about it?
So two things. One, it's really important to be able to differentiate when you're speaking equity on what makes your company special or what makes your company, the place that somebody wants to go.
Right.
But it's also, and that goes down to, it's not about, you usually can't compare equity packages. Like you can't look across 5 different offers and say they're all the same offer, compared to the amount of equity you're getting. If it's at a different stage, you might get a lower equity package, but it's high, same value.
Right.
But the biggest piece for founders is to really be able to sell what the equity piece could be and why it's so important and what your contributions are going to be in order to make it a huge value.
Right. Because equity is sort of worth nothing at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And everybody hopes that it'll be worth something.
It's all assumptive. And I think, it's funny. Long-term equity, in my opinion, I'll focus on long-term equity. And what I'm seeing in the marketplace is this really shift of long-term equity being shoved into kind of short-term incentive. And I don't think that's fair for that vehicle. Call me old school, but... all
right, you're old school.
We talk about the growth and the development of a company and what it takes to really drive that enterprise value, and it takes a lot of time. You're not going to turn over a company and take them public typically in 4 years' time. So I think that message, again, with kind of the positioning and how people are thinking about it, just the exuberance of the exits and the preferred values these days has really put a cloudy, I feel like it's put a cloudy kind of definition on what people should be expecting.
How do you advise founders to then talk about equity in their companies? Because again, most people, despite all the great stories that you hear where, Facebook folks or whomever just, made a boatload of money, most people don't from equity. Most employees don't, right? And so how do you have a sort of start off an honest conversation as a founder about the value of your equity. And ideally, it is worth a lot at the end. But again, Shannon, you said you don't have footage on the people going in, but how do you create value? How do you sell that to these potential employees?
Well, I think it's a piece of the compensation package that somebody's getting. And so regardless of how much they're actually getting, you could get one stock option, or you could get, 1,000 stock options, or 10,000 or 100,000 stock options. You're still selling the value of the company, and hence the value of the stock option the same way, which is today we're here and our goal is to be, way up here.
Right.
And so everything, like, we're giving you a piece of the company because we value what you're going to contribute. And here's the milestones we need to get through. And as you contribute to those milestones, you'll see the value of the stock option increase. And that's what equity is used for. It's an extra kicker to your base. If you have a bonus, all the other perks you have, it's something that's on top of it if we actually realize the value of what we think the company is going to be.
But Tom, to your point, do you need to be explicit about this being a sort of a long-term, play?
Well, I think you have to be kind of really genuine and try to be as authentic as possible in terms of the growth and what it's going to take. I mean, it's clearly about execution. But it's also, if you're able to message the fact that, hey, what we'll call the new hire grant or the mega grant is here to get you locked in. But the real value for us and the real value and the support that we're going to provide is as we increase our value and as we grow, you are going to be rewarded for that growth. Not only initially, but we've got to develop plans that make you want to stay here. Right. And I think so many times entrepreneurs are not thinking about strategizing and building plans that allow them to lock in that employee 6 years down the road. They're just trying to say, I'm solving for that mega grant, that 4-year new hire grant, and let's see what we can do.
Right.
But you have to be thoughtful about that footage. If you're performing, we're going to reward, and we're going to reward frequently. And I think that is a clear message that gets people in the alignment. I think compensation it has to influence people, to a certain extent, and it has to support that direction that you're trying to influence them in. And just so many times we're just not being thoughtful about that, and we're just addressing very short-term or front-end issues. So.
Are there types of equity grants and that sort of long-term retention approach that you're seeing out there that it's not one size fits all, but what are you seeing out there, and how is it working for folks?
Well, I don't even know that it's not even, there's a whole bunch of different things that are going on in the market right now. There's lots of companies that are moving to RSUs.
RSUs.
Restricted stock units.
Okay, and how does that behave differently than straight up equity?
Well, they're present value shares versus options are appreciation. It's a contract. So you're actually, you're gaining essentially that intrinsic value.
Right. And there's tax implications from one to the next?
Yeah, exactly. For the employee when it's granted.
But I think it's regardless of what vehicle you're using, it's going back to planning to retain your employees. Mm-hmm. So as we were just saying, you put all of this work into the front end issue, which is identifying and finding the right talent. Depending on how well that person does, making sure that you are piling on stock afterwards. So, and that's part of a budgeting process, right? How do you keep enough stock or options on the side so that as people start to perform, you can really pile on so that they don't think about moving on to do something different. And this is where I say, we spend so much time thinking about, like, what are we going to give people when we hire them, less time about how do we continue rewarding them. Yeah. And there are many times you really don't know how well somebody's going to do for you in the company until you get there. And you could hire like the best architect who has built like 3 incredible products. You could hire them into your organization and they could just not gel with the rest of the type of people you're hiring. And they just don't work out. And so if they decide, if you decide to go separate ways or they decide to leave, there's usually a significant amount of options that's going with them. Yeah. And so that's what I mean by you don't have good footage on how people are going to actually do in your organization until they start working in your organization.
So it sounds, again, like this is more about consistency as well. I mean, equity is as well.
My new favorite word, consistency. Consistency. Say it with me.
Do you have any particular then thoughts on RSUs versus options? I mean, if RSUs are all the rage, is there any reason to think about one versus another?
Well, I think, there was a lot of discussions, and I think it part and parcel, it's due to the competition, right? I mean, there's always the notion of, look, I have to compete with Facebook, I have to compete with Google, and their equity is in RSUs. So how do I compete with that? And that's a struggle at the end of the day, it's a struggle for any company competing with such a large enterprise with such value. And, I think this kind of goes back to the broader state of there's a lot of private companies that are worth north of $1 billion. $1 billion used to be like a significant public company, right? And these are private companies. So now and generally speaking, RSUs certainly come about for a lot of reasons. You've gotten to a level of real value that's been de-risked, where it makes sense to move to that model.
Right.
But with that said, you're also very close to an IPO or some kind of liquidation event, right? But we're seeing that pushed back, and what's causing a lot of I think consternation for me and talking to Shannon a lot of times is, look, it's sometimes a 7 to 10 year run before you're looking at an IPO, and now you're forcing kind of a present value equity form that has tax implications on employees, and it's you're not seeing the exit event as
in the near horizon.
In the near horizon, right? Whereas options, it's still more flexible from an employee perspective, right? They can, once it vests, they can either choose just to
exercise it,
exercise it or not, right? But also, it's also to the point of there's still a lot of execution that needs to get accomplished. We're not there yet, right? And I think that's really important. That's one of the biggest messages that I have for all my startups that I work with. It's it's long-term equity, and the horizon is still far out, and there's still a lot of appreciation that you can arrive from an equity perspective. And I don't know if this influences how people discuss where they're at and what they think in terms of how quickly they're going to see liquidation or not. But I kind of sense that there is this notion that there are RSUs, we should be able to liquidate them and get a piece of them sooner rather than later. And I just think that's just a mixed message, because we're paying such high premiums to get into the investments these days. And it goes back to our discussion a couple of weeks ago that there's a level of execution that you have to live up to get to that valuation. Right. And that communication doesn't necessarily set in with your employee base. Right?
What if the market changes? What changes, if anything, about what we've discussed, this idea of philosophy and consistency? Because I think the market will change, right, at some point. But then what doesn't change? And I want to ask that because I think that's the most important thing that people should walk away with, maybe.
I mean, regardless, if the market changes, we might see salaries come down. We might see, things change a little bit. We might see people stay at the companies that they're at longer. But I don't know that it changes this discussion, because this discussion is really about, building the company and building it right. And part of that is thinking about your compensation strategy. I do think, if the market, adjusts a little bit, we could see less discussion around, the value of options.
Yeah.
And this happened, right? So if you look back in, early 2000s, like nobody was negotiating options for a while. No, it was like, I need to be paid cash. I don't really care about options.
Right.
And then, it started it started to creep up again. And then, in the late 2008, 2009, those dates, like things started changing again. And once again, options were not like a big discussion. Right now, it's a great market, and there's been huge successes, and people are really excited about it, and people want to have a piece of the company that they're building. Who knows, if things adjust, like options might not become as much of the competitive offer. It goes back to cash again.
Right.
Who knows?
But again, it sounds to me like, and to sum up a little bit, that the same approach applies. You need to have this philosophy. You need to have the data to know which bands you're going to sit in and perform in and kind of aspire to. You need to keep an eye on the long term for retention and understand that execution means kind of a long-term horizon view. And then I guess be willing to adjust as the market adjusts a little bit.
And it's, if you take a step back and you think about, I'm not a very technical person, but you don't build a product without having a product roadmap.
Right.
Right. And so if you're going to build a company, you've got to have a roadmap on how you're going to attract the best talent and how you're going to retain the best talent. And this is one of those tools that if you build a really good, consistent roadmap, that's going to have changes as you get, customer feedback, and you're going to get features that you add here, and hopefully you never have to take any of the features away. But that's going to keep you going in an up market and a down market, because your employees are going to know you've thought a lot about it and you're consistent about it.
Word of the day, consistent. Shannon, thank you so much. And Tan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.